All right, we will get started now. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm so honored to get to talk to Dr. Melanie Joy. Dr. Joy is an award-winning psychologist and educator, and she's the author of 7 books, including the best-selling Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, Beyond Beliefs, and her most recent book, How to End Injustice Everywhere, which I have been recommending to people on a near daily basis. Her work has been featured in major media outlets around the world, and she has received a number of awards, including the Ahimsa Award, previously given to the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela, for her work on global nonviolence. Melanie has given talks and trainings in over 50 countries, and she's also the founding president of the international NGO Beyond Carnism. And you can learn more about her work at carnism.org. The message in How to End Injustice Everywhere seems to apply to everyone, not just vegans and animal rights activists. And it's one of those books that I think could be rewritten and marketed as a business leadership book. And I think it could also be maybe reframed and marketed to veterinarians in particular, which is pertinent to our audience. And those veterinarians who really want to build more effective teams and communicate better with clients, and hopefully advocate for more relational policies in their practices. And you say, I wrote this book because I believe that a missing link in the existing literature on progressive social change is an understanding of the psychological and most notably the relational drivers of injustice, the mentality and its resultant behaviors that drives all forms of injustice is the same. So can you discuss this further and sort of give us an example of this?
Yeah, totally. First of all, thank you for such a warm welcome. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. I did not write How to End Injustice Everywhere specifically for people working for animals. I actually wrote it for anybody who's working for progressive change, anybody who wants to help end injustice, whether that injustice is toward humans, toward non-human animals, toward the environment, or, even in smaller systems rather than, just these broad social systems, in their workplaces, people working in, toxic workplaces or in their interpersonal relationships. So, basically all injustices, right? Like racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, environmental degradation, domestic abuse, and so on. They share a common denominator. And this common denominator is relational dysfunction, okay, or dysfunctional, counterproductive, unhealthy ways of relating to other individuals, between social groups, to non-human animals, and to the environment. And also between us and ourselves, like we're always relating to ourselves. Our primary relationship is actually with ourselves. So, for people for whom this sounds like an abstraction, you're relating to yourself every minute of every day through, for instance, your self-talk. And most of us talk to ourselves in a way we would never tolerate coming from others. You relate to yourself through the choices that you make that impact your future self and so on. So this relational dysfunctional ways of relating, it stems from a particular psychology or a mindset. I refer to this as the non-relational mentality. This is like the mentality that is at the foundation of all forms of injustice, whether they're on a micro level or on a macro level. What this mentality does is it causes people to think and feel and act in ways that violate their own integrity, right? It's basically to not practice the golden rule of treating others the way that they would want to be treated, and that harm the dignity of others. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit later for everyone, but I'll just give you like a quick overview. This results, when we act in this way, when we act according to this mentality, it results in us feeling disconnected, in a sense of disconnection, and also in a sense of insecurity. And when it comes to group level dynamics, it also results in power imbalances in those group dynamics. So, for example, if you think about the smallest system, interpersonal system, that's like a relationship between two people, if we're leaving our own intrapersonal system out of it, and you think of an abusive relationship, right? The abuser, the person engaging in the abusive behavior, we'll assume it's one person, is acting in ways that violate their own integrity, right? That do not reflect compassion and justice, that do not treat the other person with respect, right? So somebody who's being abusive is not treating somebody else the way that they would want to be treated if they were in that person's position. They're harming the dignity of that other individual in the relationship. Our dignity is our sense of inherent or intrinsic worth, right? So when you harm somebody's dignity, that means you think of and treat them as though they are less worthy of being treated with respect and of occupying space on this planet than you or others are. So an abusive person or a person engaging in abusive behaviors is violating their own integrity. They're harming the dignity of the other person. This results in disconnection and insecurity in the relationship, and it leads to an unjust power imbalance. The more one person is engaging in abusive behaviors, the more the power imbalance between those two individuals grows. And I say unjust power imbalances because there are plenty of power imbalances that are not unjust, like the imbalance of power between like a parent and a child, for example. So until those of us who are helping to bring about justice, like really understand relational dysfunction, specifically what it looks like, and know how to change it, we're at risk of recreating injustice even as we work to end it, right? And our movements are at risk of cannibalizing themselves. Because the same mentality that drives us to act unjustly, right, dysfunctionally, relationally, just dysfunctionally toward other individuals or as members of social groups, is the mentality that causes us to engage in infighting in our own groups and our own movements. It's the same mentality at the core of all of these different problems, these different, we could say unjust systems. So I wrote How to End Injustice Everywhere to really shed light on this, the common structure of all unjust systems: patriarchy, racism, speciesism, carnism, all of these unjust systems, including smaller systems, as well as this common mentality that drives these systems. So one of my goals is to help advocates who are working to end any kind of injustice to really understand the interconnectedness of all injustices, right? If we fail to pick out the common threads that are woven through all unjust systems, then we're doomed to recreate injustice in new forms, because injustice starts inside of us. It starts in our mentality. It starts in our attitudes. And with this understanding, advocates for humans, for non-human animals, or for the environment, they're better able to support each other's efforts. It doesn't mean we all have to work for the same causes, but we're much better able to support each other's efforts rather than to thwart each other's efforts and to unify across causes. I also wanted to help people who are working for progressive change to more effectively advocate to others, like to attract supporters to whatever cause they're working for. And I'm sure, people here have seen, maybe you've experienced this yourself, people who may be promoting, say veganism or, animal justice, whatever, and doing it in a way that's actually driving people away from the cause rather than attracting them to it. It's because, again, this same mentality, this what I call non-relational mentality, is the mentality that causes us to advocate in unproductive and even counterproductive ways. And finally, I wanted to really provide practical tools to help advocates reduce infighting. The last chapter on the book is infighting, and to really build more resilient and impactful groups and movements for justice. And this includes movements like, organizations that are working to help end some form of injustice. And the last chapter in the book is on ending how to end infighting. And that chapter, in my mind, actually mushroomed, this is what happens to me sometimes, into something else, which could have been another book, but I promised myself, that's it, I'm done. No more nonfiction books. So all of the research, it's been 7. The next one is going to be fiction, if and when. But I took that information. I did a deep dive into all things infighting for about 1.5 years. And wrote up my findings and my thoughts and analyses and so on and so forth into this document that actually was 45,000 words, which was as long as my 6th book. And I was like, oh, this could be a book. And then I decided, maybe it's better served as a website. So we actually published recently, just a couple of months ago, we launched infighting.org. And that is, all of that information is on the website, and it's very easily and readily accessible. And more fun, I think, interesting to access than a book. So yeah, so basically, just to summarize, just to wrap up, sorry for this very long answer, but it's setting the tone for everything else we talk about. So since relational dysfunction is a common denominator driving injustices. A common denominator driving, or to help end them is the opposite, which is building relational literacy. Relational literacy is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And we can talk about that and unpack that if you want a little bit more specifically, so people know what I'm talking about. But that's kind of a summation of the things we're going to be unpacking here.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to that. And kind of the world, teaches us to be non-relational in many ways and tests us in all of these ways. And you open the book by
Totally.
talking about catching your first fish and feeling confused. And I think this really highlights how all of us have participated in non-relational behaviors, things that harm others at some point in our lives. And you instantly realize that you did something wrong, but many people don't immediately respond that way. And sometimes it takes us years to understand that the harm that we have been normalized to. And Arnold Arluck performed this study where he spoke to human medical students who had to practice surgery on dogs and kill them. And at first, the students were very apprehensive about the laboratory, but after they did it, they commented that it was an important learning experience, which really sort of highlights how people rationalize and legitimize the harm that they
Right.
caused and become socialized to it. And in my undergrad years, I participated in a lab where I cut off a young sheep's tail with a hot blade with no anesthesia, and I banded testicles. And a lot of our medical training kind of feels like this trauma bonding, and it feels like many of us are similar to cult survivors, where we were led to believe what we did was necessary. And when we suddenly realize how we were indoctrinated into legitimizing these things, and we want to report concerns about these harmful practices, then we not only face backlash from our profession, but many of us, have been barred from attending AVMA symposiums and legislative fly-ins and all of these things, and backlash from AVMA leadership for them saying that we would create an unsafe space. But we also face backlash from animal rights activists who condemn us for taking part in violence against animals and not realizing the harm that we cause sooner. When a former laboratory animal veterinarian who now is an animal rights activist shared her story, these are some of the things that animal rights activists said about her. That's great, but frankly, she was a monster for years. She's a bit late in her actions. Karma will prevail. A pig veterinarian who is now an animal rights activist had to withstand comments like, "It's weird for me how you could cut their tails with no painkillers, and it took you that much time for it to click. I went vegan only after researching. I could never harm an animal." Another one says that these humans need the death penalty. Another one said, "Cruel monsters experiment on animals, may they rot in hell." So understanding that, these activists too are likely good people who don't understand the harm of their words. How should we respond when our fellow activists say things like that?
I mean, before talking about that, because that's a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to really think about this on a case by case basis. I think, you raise really, really good points. And, this commentary, again, this kind of commentary, this violent, very emotionally, psycho-emotionally violent commentary, people who call it toxic communication or whatever, this again reflects what I call the non-relational mentality. Here it is again in action. And so it reflects a profound lack of understanding of human psychology and behavior and of non-relational, what I call non-relational systems in the first place. And so I'm going to unpack this a little bit and then get to your question. I want to just define for people who are listening relational versus non-relational, because we're using these terms and I want people to understand what exactly they mean, when I'm referring to them. So, at the core, I talked about relational literacy a couple of minutes ago. Relational literacy is based on a number of principles and tools, but at the core of all of these, the foundation of all of these is what I call the formula for healthy relating, which we touched upon already. This is a formula that applies to every interaction, every relationship. A relationship is really just a series of interactions, whether it's between social groups or, among members in a workplace or in interpersonal interactions between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment, between us and ourselves, and so on and so forth. This, and of course, it applies to how we communicate, because communication is the primary way we relate. And the formula is this, which I mentioned earlier. We practice integrity. That means we treat the other individual, or ourselves with respect, the way we would want to be treated if we were in that position. We honor dignity. This leads to a sense of connection and security. And it exists on a spectrum, right? An interaction or relationship can be more or less relational and healthy, or non-relational and unhealthy. And non-relational behaviors are those that are the opposite of relational ones. They are ones in which we violate our integrity, harm the dignity of others, and this leads to a sense of disconnection and insecurity. So this is what I'm referring to when I talk about relational and non-relational. And so often, like let me back up, I'm talking about behaviors right now, but systems also exist on this spectrum of relationality, right? And a system is just an entity. In this case, we're talking about living systems, an entity made up of two or more people, or individuals, I should say, right? So your relationship is a system, your workplace is a system, we've got social systems, and so on and so forth. Non-relational systems are those unjust systems like patriarchy, racism, speciesism, and toxic workplace, and so on and so forth. Non-relational systems are very often traumatic or traumatizing systems. They basically are made up of, and they drive us to play one of three roles that we tend to play in a traumatic event, right? And to think of people as having to play one of these three roles. You're either a victim of the system, in this case, what you're talking about is the animal victims, right? And they're very clear, direct victims. Or you're a hero, which is you're working to protect the victims and end the exploitation, end the injustice, or you're a perpetrator in the system. And the problem is that most people do not recognize that one can be, and very often is, playing multiple roles in a system. So you look at like slaughterhouse workers, for example, or you look at veterinarians in training, like you're talking about, who are being deeply, deeply conditioned and socialized to act against their integrity, right? To violate the dignity of others, to engage in harm, harm that really runs counter to their core values, and that requires them to shut down their empathy to do this. And people on the outside, all they see is perpetrator, without recognizing that these kinds of actions, these kinds of attitudes and actions, they don't exist in a vacuum. They are the result of deep indoctrination. They are a result of normalization. They are a result of like young people being told by people in positions of authority, this is what you're supposed to do. This is the right thing to do. This is how you serve the greater good. And so on and so forth. It's really, really important to get this. And also to get, your description of these commentaries makes me think of, it reminds me of, soldiers who were returning from the Vietnam War, who were victims of this system, who were, suffering from PTSD and a lot of other serious problems, and then who were getting booed and attacked by peaceful protesters who were against the war, who failed to recognize at the time, today it's a little bit different, today things are shifting, but who failed to recognize at the time that one can be a so-called perpetrator and a victim simultaneously, and very often is. And one of the things that happens when people act against their deeper values of compassion, for example, act against their empathy, is that they can, even if they don't develop PTSD, they can develop something that is often a symptom of PTSD, but not always. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's called moral injury. Mm-hmm. Moral injury is the harm that is done to us psychologically when we either act in a way that is against our values and causes harm, or fail to take action and allow harm to action. And it's a very, there's more and more research being done on moral injury among people who are working with animals, and I should say on animals. And this is a very real phenomenon. And it is it's an example of how people who cause harm to animals are also people who have been harmed themselves and who suffer. And moral injury can be very, very traumatizing to people who experience it. How to respond really depends. You have to take that on a case-by-case basis. I think understanding is really important, because it can be very easy to internalize these negative messages that you hear about yourself. A lot of people who care about animals and who, wake up to the harm, the reality of the harm that they were coerced into participating in, can become traumatized by that and feel a lot of deep and profound shame around it. Knowing that, you are and have been a product of this system, and that, from a psychological perspective, each and every one of us is nothing more and nothing less than the hardwiring and biology that we were born with, and every momentary experience that we've had in our lives. Like, nobody can be any different than who and how they are. Expecting people to be any different from who and how they are is like expecting a tree that's been rained on not to be wet. And so it's very easy for people, who are not walking in your shoes to look in and say, oh, if I had been in your position, I wouldn't have done what you did. I would never have experimented on animals. But of course you would, because you would have been born into the same brain and biology, and you would have had the same life experiences that led you to that same moment. Of course you would have done exactly the same thing. So it's recognizing this can sort of at least help people not internalize the negative messages. And then you can decide, how you want to respond, and if you even want to respond. And often it's, more effective to respond with a unified voice, maybe a collective, well thought out, what's the word called when it's a letter that's public? I'm totally
Like an open
blanking
letter,
on this.
yeah.
An
Or like,
open letter,
yeah.
public letter, could be a way to go. But, all you can do is speak from your own experience. It's the only experience and, nobody can make your story wrong. But you do need to decide if you even want to speak to it. Most important, in my opinion, is not allowing shaming, non-relational communication, which is typically shaming communication, not allowing it to, not giving people a platform, delete comments, do not forward comments, block people, make it really clear this is the kind of commentary that's like not acceptable and it's going to be deleted.
Yeah, I love that. I've given this presentation to animal rights activists called Veterinarians Need Your Help, where I kind of go through all of these things and the things that animal rights activists have said. So we're very much like, we want to partner with you, but these are some of the harmful things, and how can we kind of move past that? I actually talk about Vietnam War and the book Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress by Rachel McNair. And there's a book called Achilles in Vietnam that I highly recommend to a lot of people that goes into that too. So that's wonderful. And kind of another issue that comes up in our movement too is, we talk about systems. We don't want to perpetuate this hero, victim, perpetrator mentality, but we have a problem with concerns about men in positions of power in our movement who allegedly abuse their power and give opportunities to those they are romantically interested in, retaliating against those who reject them or report concerns. So some are concerned that women do not speak up for fear of discussing such concerns, and that might lead to infighting and would harm our movement. So I know you've talked about infighting before. Maybe you can go into a little bit about what is infighting and how can activists discuss concerns without perpetuating infighting?
Yeah, it's such a great question and such a great point. And, first of all, infighting is not in disagreeing. It is not in disagreeing, right? Disagreements about various issues. People are different and people are going to have different opinions, from philosophy to strategy to values. These disagreements, they're essential for creating a diverse and impactful movement. And some of these disagreements are particularly important, like, as you're saying, when women, people of color and so on, they challenge imbalances of power in the movement. And so we really need to be careful not to refer to healthy challenges that are helping a movement, or a group evolve as infighting, or we could be weaponizing the concept and silencing critical voices. So, what is infighting then? How do we tell the difference? Infighting is basically the same as what we could call outfighting, right? As any kind of fighting, except that it's directed toward members of one's own group. And as I said, this means the same attitudes and behaviors that drive us apart are those that drive others away from our message and that drive injustice more broadly. And one of the nice things is that, like, you kind of come at this problem from any sort of angle. Like, when we understand how to stop infighting, we also understand how to more effectively advocate, and we more understand how to more effectively help end injustices. So basically, infighting is not about the content, it's about the process. And let me explain what I mean by that. Infighting is, we tend to think of this as like, these big fights on a movement-wide level, and the big sort of like really egregious examples of it, which are usually what I would call in bullying rather than in fighting, because a fight implies that there are like at least two people or more involved, but in bullying happens a lot. But infighting happens when the same way fighting happens, when two or more individuals have a difference. Usually it's a difference of opinion or a difference of want or need, whatever. And they use aggression in order to try to force the other person to change. Infighting, basically, most infighting takes place through communication, what we could call toxic communication, right? Because the primary way we relate, as I said earlier, is through communication. So most of the way we fight with each other is through communicating with each other in a way that's non-relational. Now, it's basically, infighting is made up of primarily non-relational, or what we can call toxic communication. Now, with every communication has two parts. There's the content, that's what we're communicating about. And then there's the process, and that's how we're communicating. Most of us tend to over-focus on the content. We feel like, oh my God, I've got to get my words right. I've got to make my point perfectly. I've got to make sure people really understand my opinion, deliver the zinger. Most people tend to over-focus on the content and under-focus on the process, but the process matters more. So like, if you think about, just try to think about a conversation you had like maybe 6 months ago, like at a dinner party or out on a date or whatever, maybe a year ago, whatever. Chances are you might have actually forgotten the entire content. You actually don't even remember what you were talking about. But chances are also that you still remember how you felt in that conversation. Mm-hmm. The process determines how we feel. When our process is healthy or relational, we can basically talk about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy or non-relational, we can't really talk about anything without arguing. You might know people who like have everything in common and basically agree on almost anything, and yet they still sort of find ways to argue with each other. In a healthy process, we practice the formula for healthy relating, as I said. And in a healthy process, our goal is not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong. It's not to win, which means to make the other person lose. This is what happens in the debate model. And a lot of verbal fighting is basically people debating in a way that turns into sort of toxicity. Our goal is mutual understanding. And we communicate with, we stay connected to our empathy. We're non-judgmental to the best of our ability. We are human. And our goal is mutual understanding. The only reason we communicate in the first place, one reason that we communicate, and that's because we're not mind readers. The goal of our communication is simply to enable the other person to understand what we are thinking and feeling and maybe needing, and to understand what they are thinking and feeling and needing. And when we can communicate effectively, then we can talk about just about anything. Now, this gets tricky when we're talking about, imbalances of power and people who are using their power, as a way to exploit and abuse, which is what you're talking about. I think it's very important that people build, but what I would call power literacy, like really understanding, and this goes beyond the scope of this conversation, but I talk about it in the book, like really understanding what does it look like when somebody is not relating to the power that they have in a way that's healthy, which, by the way, most people do, because that's what power does to us. I'm not excusing, I'm explaining. So what does that really look like? You know, okay, so this person is interrupting, this person is taking credit for somebody else's work, this person is making sexual advances, which is like, you know, illegal to staff members, you know, really being able to identify things that can be easily normalized and recognize them as abuses of power and as problematic. That's really important. And I believe that at this point in time, it's been really, really important for people in general and, you know, women and, you know, BIPOC, people who have less power, to really develop power literacy and to really understand what it looks like when somebody is in a position of power or privilege and they are abusing that, you know, to recognize the nuances, to recognize the way that their space is invaded, to recognize the way that they may be being shamed and shrunk and their dignity is being harmed in ways that are, you know, highly toxic. A lot of people have developed this literacy, but haven't alongside that developed relational literacy. So now we see, you know, one of the problems that we have in a lot of justice movements is like people who have woken up to abuses of power and are challenging that, but haven't actually developed enough relational literacy to be able to differentiate between, you know, an intentional and genuine abuse of power and a sort of misuse of power that was non-intended and doesn't necessarily need to cause harm, and to be able to communicate about that.
Yeah, and there's so many good pearls. I was like rapidly taking notes. That was such amazing content all right there.
Oh, thank you.
But I think we have to also kind of understand the psychology of what causes people to not speak out sooner. And there's often, you know, criticism like of us that we talked about before, of veterinarians and women in animal advocacy for not talking about these things sooner and staying silent. And one woman who came forward, somebody said, I'm curious why you would choose to speak out now versus when all of the other information was coming out about the people that they abused in years past. So, and they're often, you know, suddenly people are skeptical of them for suddenly speaking out now, like they're taking advantage of a situation or something. So can you talk about why might someone not speak out sooner, but feel empowered to later on?
I mean, first of all, people have to feel safe enough to speak out, and safe enough doesn't just mean on a practical level. You know, they have to feel emotionally safe enough to speak out, because when you do, you know, you risk a backlash. You know, you risk people making up stories about you. You risk people calling you opportunistic, which is, you know, your example. You risk people disbelieving something that you're saying that could be, you know, a profoundly traumatic experience that you've had. And then you experience, you know, feel re-traumatized by that. So you need to be in a position where you feel, I mean, physically safe enough to, obviously, and also psychologically and emotionally safe enough to speak out, that like, you know, that you can withstand whatever backlash might come your way. If you feel just too vulnerable and too raw, you know, the safest path, you know, the path of least resistance is probably to say nothing. And people also don't speak out sooner because it's one hallmark of being in a dynamic that is abusive, is that you lose your ability over time to trust the truth of your own perceptions and of your own experience. And so if we look at like an abusive relationship, like interpersonal relationship, just as an example, because it might just be easier for people to see this, when somebody is in an abusive relationship, you know, this imbalance of power tends to grow over time, where the abuser, I don't want to say abuser, but the person who's doing the abuse is I try to not assign identities to people and focus more on behaviors. So that's why I'm saying the person engaging in the abuse is acting in ways that are disempowering the other person. Like, this is what happens in abusive relationships. One person is wielding power and control over the other, and this wielding of power and control over the other can take a variety of forms. Psychological power and control is always a part of it. It's, you know, they can be physically preventing them from making their own decisions, like limiting the other person's access to finances, limiting the other person's access to their friends and family. And psychologically, what typically happens is that the person engaging in the abusive behavior is communicating to the other person that the other person's perceptions are wrong. I didn't hit you. It was a little shove. I didn't yell at you. I'm just pointing something out, because I think it's important that you know that, and you don't want to hear the truth. So now you're turning it into a fight. I'm not complaining. I'm just giving you important feedback so that you can be a better partner to me. I mean, all you do is like criticize me. So many ways in which this person, very, very, very often, this what's called defining reality. Some people know this as in its more extreme form, which is gaslighting, is a part of an abusive relationship and abusive behavior, where you're constantly telling the other person that their perception of their own reality is wrong. Their feelings, their thoughts, their needs are wrong. And over time, as this occurs again and again, and by the way, we all do this to some degree. So if people listening are like, oh my God, am I an abuser? I do this, we do, because we've been born into an incredibly relationally dysfunctional world that has I've said this many times, where most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and we don't get a single formal lesson in how to be healthy relational beings, right? When you look at the big problems in our world and in our lives, they're not caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. So, so we all do this, we all define other people's reality by telling them like, oh, I know you knew that I was going to give you a gift for your birthday party. You were pretending to be ignorant to that, or whatever it may be. The less you can do this in your life and your relationships, the better, just commit to doing it less. But if you do it, that makes you normal. And in an abusive relationship, very often this kind of form of defining reality, gaslighting, is very normal. And so what happens over time is that the person who's being abused really believes that they're not being abused. And it takes time for them to be, once they're removed from that relationship, and they can start to reconnect with the truth of their own experience and start to retrust themselves and reconnect with people that they may not have been connected with before, who can help them reframe what their experience was so that they can more accurately perceive it as the abuse that it was. People need to be able to get to that point where they've reclaimed being the experts of their own experience before they can or will speak out.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. But in like today's world, there's kind of this view of like, oh, we're infantilizing others, we're infantilizing women or BIPOC. And there's this kind of belief that, oh, animals are more important, women and BIPOC can defend themselves. So we shouldn't discuss our concerns about those in power who are doing great work for the animals who may be harming other people, for fear that if we discuss those concerns openly or publicly, it would damage their reputation and their ability to do good work for the animals. But might this create an environment where there's no countervailing pressure on men in positions of power, for instance, to elevate their standards of conduct and allow these harmful patterns to persist for years until things get so bad that it becomes a huge scandal? Or on the other hand, are men and animal rights being attacked and criticized unfairly because we tend to be so woke? Or do those in animal advocacy have a tendency to cover up for men in power because they do such good work for animals? So how can we tell when concerns are actually valid versus not, versus just infiltrators?
I mean, I can speak only from my experience. I don't know if there's actually ever been research done on this to get the real statistics and the numbers on it. I think both are probably true. It is true that, people in power, men in power, white people in power in the movement are abusing their power and are not being held accountable because of this fear that they're doing great work for the animals. So we want to not rock the boat. And it's also true that there are people who are being attacked without, that there's a book called Conflict is Not Abuse. I have not read the whole thing. It was recommended to me, and I've read a little bit of it, so I can't really speak to it too much. But the gist of the book is that, it's really important to differentiate conflict from abuse. And, you know, in a climate where a lot of people have woken up to abuses of power, which has been really, really important, and we've needed this to happen, we're starting to see this sort of like inversion of the power dynamic. You know, people are punching up, so to speak. And, you know, I've personally witnessed a number of people being accused of abuses of power that were not, in fact, abusing their power. So it's happening from, you know, both of these problems are true, you know, that you point out. And how we tell when concerns are valid and when they're not. We need to, you know, we need to take these on the case by case basis. There isn't one answer to this. I would say that organizations and groups really need to build in DEI training and awareness. And also relational literacy, both, you know, power literacy, understanding of how issues of DEI, you know, play out, how issues of privilege and power can play out, as I said earlier. And also, you know, really understanding how to communicate about these issues so that open conversations can happen. I mean, if somebody is really abusing power, then obviously an open conversation may not be possible for them. A lot of what we see these days, at least in my experience, is less, you know, since Me Too and since Black Lives Matter, less overt abuses of power and more sort of covert abuses of power.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's it's especially challenging when it's like, well, there was no sexual assault, but you know, there might be other issues. And another kind of issue is kind of the difference between how activists should talk to other activists versus how activists should talk to power holders who are outside our movement, who are hoping to change. There's often this us versus them dynamic. And in activism, there's this view that power holders are only going to change if they suffer some reputational or economic consequences. And that's historically been true. Successful actions involve, you know, loud actions, home demonstrations, and public support grows over time because of the urgency and the crisis communicated to the public. And there's this belief in the need for trigger points, and the public won't come on board unless there's something to get the public's attention, like the Black Lives Matter movement or the activism of ACT UP. But some critics might say that, you know, no one would be telling a mother who lost their child in war to confront systems of violence in a more relational way. And they might say that we're putting an unfair amount of pressure on specifically animal rights activists and holding them to a different standard. But is there any difference between how activists should communicate with each other versus how movements should speak to power holders who they're hoping to change?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. You know, people who are in more sort of marginalized communities, who are smaller in numbers, you know, activists like animal, you know, I've lately been saying animal justice activists, because I actually think that I think that we can look at the animal rights movement, animal liberation, you know, the vegan movement, and so on and so forth, the sort of sub movements of this broader animal justice movement, and that sort of helps get people recognizing that, you know, how we relate to animals is a matter of justice, just like how we relate to the environment and other humans. So that's why I'm using the term animal justice. So I think, you know, people are typically held to higher standards when they have less power and when they're more marginalized. I mean, this is true for, you know, going back to, you know, women or gender. You know, you're held to higher standards. You're expected to be more perfect. You're expected, you know, to frame everything in the perfect way. And if you don't, you know, if you don't share your criticisms in, you know, the most gentle and, you know, articulate way, then we're going to find a reason, you know, we're going to use this and latch onto this as a reason to make you wrong and basically erase everything you've said. So there's surely truth in what you're saying. I would say that I am not suggesting that activists not be angry. or express anger. I would not say that it wouldn't be rational and it wouldn't be strategic, and it certainly wouldn't be healthy or relational. And I am not saying not to speak out. And this comes up, people read my book and I talk about relational communication and how important it is when we're working to change unjust systems to make sure that our communication is as relational as possible. People often interpret this as saying that we should be sort of hand-holding and sort of like gently guiding people who are causing massive harm and exploitation. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, number one, anger is healthy. Anger, your anger is the normal and legitimate emotional response to witnessing or experiencing injustice. Your anger is a sign that your moral compass is working, right? And so, anger is what is the emotion that motivates us to be proactive, to take positive action on our own or others' behalf. So I want to honor our anger and recognize that. Speaking out is also really important. And how we relate to our anger is what I'm talking about. How we relate to our anger matters. If we relate to our anger in a healthy way, we'll be able to use it to help rather than harm. If we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way, we are probably going to contribute to more harm than good. We have a right to be angry, just like, in your example, a mother who lost her child in a war, who's confronting systems of violence, has every right to be angry and to speak out about that anger. How she relates to that anger will quite likely determine how people respond to her requests or demands for change. So if we want to be strategic, we need to be careful. And if we want to be sustainable, careful to relate to our anger in a healthy way. The same as if we want to be sustainable. A lot of people, a lot of activists burn out. And one of the reasons that they burn out is because they are not relating to their anger in a healthy way. And they're crashing and burning in, a ball of moral outrage. And often taking other activists down with them and being very ineffective ambassadors for the cause. When we relate to our anger in a healthy way, what it means is this: we recognize it for what it is. It is nothing more and nothing less than an emotion. It is an emotion that is a data point. It's an emotion that's arising in us that is giving us information. That information is that we might be experiencing injustice. And I say might be because a lot of people get angry at what they perceive as injustice when it's not unjust. Back to the, example of an abusive relationship, somebody who's being abusive might get explosively angry at the partner who doesn't have dinner ready and hasn't cleaned the whole house for them in preparation for the return from work at the end of the day. Is that anger at an injustice? It's anger at a perceived injustice because of the entitlement this person has. So our anger is a data point. It's nothing more and nothing less than that. It's an emotion. When we relate to it in a healthy way, we recognize this. When we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way, we blend with it. We don't see our anger as a data point. We don't explore it and learn from it. We become merged with it. We and our anger are one. We don't say, I'm feeling angry, or even better, a part of me is feeling angry. We say, I am angry. I and the anger are one. We're looking at the world through the lens of our anger, and we can get really hijacked by it. And when we relate to our anger in a healthy way, it has the charge of contempt. Contempt is basically anger plus judgment. Contempt, research has shown that contempt is the one emotion most likely to destroy relationships and to drive people away. When we feel contempt, what that means is that we have placed ourselves psychologically in a position of moral superiority to whoever it is that we're feeling contempt for. We are perceiving them as less than. We're perceiving them as inferior. We're perceiving them, we're basically harming their dignity in our minds. And generally, we start acting in ways that harm their dignity. When we feel contempt, this drives us to communicate, to relate, and particularly to communicate in a way that's shaming of the other. The flip side of contempt is shame. Contempt is feeling like, you're morally superior to others, that you have more worth, inherent worth than others do. And shame is feeling that you're morally inferior to others, that you have less inherent worth than others do. And when we shame people, when we communicate in a way that shames people, that is not about their behavior, but that's about who they are. We vastly reduce the chances that our message will be heard as we intend it to be. And we vastly increase the chances that we will be met with defensiveness and resistance. And I can talk about that for a very long time, but I'll leave it at that. We can be angry, we can speak out about our anger, and we need to. And if we do that in a way that honors the dignity of those we're talking about, we focus on behavior, not character. We don't put people down. We don't shame people. We don't have to. That's the good news. We don't have to. Like what we're talking about when we're talking about injustice toward animals, we're talking about an atrocity, like an unbelievable global atrocity. We don't need to embellish it. We don't need to talk about the people who are driving it as, shameful people. All we need to do is expose the truth, and the truth speaks for itself. And when we do that, we don't turn ourselves into the quote unquote bad guys, by being people who others would feel unsafe around.
Yeah, and it's so funny how you talk about that. I was just in this article discussing the use of ventilation shutdown, and I tried to do it in a very relational way. And I don't, shame the producer who did it, but still, I was attacked as somebody who's attacking this poor farmer. And it's like, no, I want him, I want to help him put plans in place so he doesn't have to do this again. That's my goal here. But yeah, and it kind of goes to the point of kind of when a quote I loved was somebody told me, if you want to fight the devil, you have to get your hands on him. But so I want to, I'm not saying that they're the devil though, because that's the non-relation. We don't want to call names. But I like kind of that thought of connecting with the other side. But I think, when we're fighting the monster, although that's very non-relational language, we don't want to become the monster that we fight. I think it's
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you make a really good point too, because you're talking about how you really tried to communicate in a way that was relational. You just objectively lay out the facts, and you share the facts, you share the truth of what's happening, and yet you're still attacked as being an attacker, and that can happen. There's no guarantee. Like people may feel ashamed even if you're not shaming. People may feel attacked even if you're not attacking, and you can't do anything about that. It's just that the more relational your communication is, the less likely people are going to feel attacked and ashamed, but it's not a guarantee. But the only thing you have control over is yourself. We just need to stay on our own sides of the street. And that's really the best that we can do.
Mm-hmm. And regarding kind of staying on our own side of the street, I know we have limited time, 5 minutes left, but I used to tell people, like, join the American Veterinary Medical Association, this group that's been very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So we can kind of change the culture of the organization from within. And I used to think the same thing about certain organizations with histories of retaliation and things like that. I thought we could join them and change the culture, but now I'm kind of not so sure about that. On one hand, good, well-adjusted people see these groups and sort of back away slowly. And those who remain affiliated with them never really hear critiques of their practices. So I'm kind of wondering, like, should we try to join these groups that are very toxic, or is the toxicity too ingrained that it's probably best to stay away from them and criticize them from the outside?
That's like the $1 million question, right? And it's like, I personally believe that so I'm not in the veterinary space. You know better than I do. I do believe that transforming systems from both the inside out and the outside in simultaneously, if that's possible, is the most strategic way to move forward. And, you just have to have realistic expectations, right? If there's a system that's like, highly organized to be resistant to certain types of information, or it's highly non-relational, it'll take a lot of people and a long time to shift it. But if you do join you know, and you recognize that what you're doing is you're nudging rather than transforming the system, you know, that realistic expectation might make it easier. And I do think it's really, really important for there to be people within these systems that are giving voice to these issues. And my sense is that there are probably many, many people within the existing system. It's the AVMA, right? You said?
Yeah.
The AVMA, you know, that actually would be receptive to a lot of what you're talking about, but don't have a way of having those conversations, don't have a safe space for having those conversations. But, you know, is there a working group within the AVMA that's discussing animal rights issues, animal justice issues?
No, they specifically do not want, and I brought up like we should have a kind of a roundtable discussion where we bring together some animal protection groups so we can have an open dialogue, and they did not respond to that request. So
I mean, one thing that I can say is over the years, like a number of years now, I think it's been like, how old am I? Anyway, it's like, I think 12 years that I've been traveling around a lot, all over the world. I meet veterinarians everywhere. I get emails from veterinarians from all over the world. And, you know, they're saying, oh my God, I wish there was like some group I could be a part of. I wish, because there are so many veterinarians, because people go to veterinary school. Most people, my guess, who go to veterinary school, you know, you're not in it for the money. You're not going there to get rich. It's people who care about animals, want to help heal them. And then all of a sudden there's this shock to the system. So you're talking about a lot of low-hanging fruits and just a way of bringing them all together. I did meet a guy who has been starting up an organization there was an organization a while back, Veterinarians for Animal Rights, I think it was called, right? You know, who's been working on starting a new organization that is kind of picking up where they left off. So I very much think an external organization is really, really important, and people within the AVMA, you know, the more people you can have there who are nudging, the better.
Yeah. That's what, I mean, our honor, that's what we hope to do. We have a community of veterinarians who we all believe this, and we all believe in animal justice. So thank you so much. I mean, in the last few minutes, if I can get you to squeeze in any ideas for how systems of addressing misconduct, maybe it's something you could do in the future as part of infighting. How can we implement like maybe rules or code of conduct or systems to protect those with less power in organizations?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is that you don't need me to answer this in 2 minutes, because there are consultants and consultancy organizations that do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and they come in and they will actually tell an organization, give them guidelines, and you don't even need that. There's a lot of info. I mean, it's great if you can get a consultant to come in and actually work with your own group or your own organization. It's a great thing. And there's so much information these days online about like just simple basic policies to implement, basic readings, you know, to have people, so that people have at least a certain level of literacy around injustice, privilege, and oppression, and a certain level of literacy around, you know, relationality and how to communicate effectively. That can go a really long way. But there are templates out there and sort of like guide lists out there and guidebooks out there for anybody who wants to like learn about, you know, practical implementations.
Thank you so much. This was so great, inspiring, educational. I think everybody who will watch this will take a lot from it. So I appreciate your time so much, and your
great.
And all of your books and your website, infighting.org, and carnism.org too.
Carnism.org. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you guys all for the work you're doing. I'm really heartened by it, and just glad, you know, to support you guys and what you're doing. I think it's amazing and super important. So was really happy to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. And y'all have a good day. I will upload this to YouTube in a little bit. And thank you all so much for coming, and see y'all next time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.